Russia becoming occupied by domestic tensions, central regional disputes, racially charged ones, as we've seen in Dagestan last year at the airport, Chechnya historically, obviously, and generally areas that I think Putin is trying to prioritize, mobilization from.
The more rational decision is to kill Putin yourself so you can guarantee your own power and your longevity after his death.
There are people more extreme than Putin. I mean, Putin is extreme, but there are people who are even more radical and think that Putin is not doing enough.
But I think one of the biggest mistakes Putin ever made was the fact that he allowed semi-private militaries to be created. I mean, that's really a recipe for disaster.
This is The Global Gambit.
A lot of focus is on Ukraine and the supposed gains that Russia is making, supposedly, in eastern areas of Kyiv and the continued occupied territories. However, things are changing quite a lot in Russia as well. Vladimir Putin is coming to the end of his swift and, what some people would like to say, meaningful trip to North Korea and Vietnam. But that's also because of what's happening within the country. Increasingly, a tightening, a growing concern around the fiscal, monetary, and generally economic situation. Just a few days ago, we saw the Russian central bank discontinue the trading of dollars and euros, causing many Russians to go over the counter. So when you see statistics claiming that the Russian ruble is gaining against the dollar, that's not actually taking into account what's actually happening in the country in terms of people having to go and do transactions in person without the guarantees of a central bank system, meaning the actual rate is about 150 rubles per dollar. That being said, the central bank has also reacted to the tightening of US sanctions, and Reuters, at the time of recording, has reported that China and Russia are trying to continue to find workarounds for US sanctions. All of that and more coming up in this conversation as we speak to, hopefully I could say a friend of the channel, Jason J. Smart, who is a political advisor and has lived and worked across Ukraine, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and even Latin America. He is actually in democratic opposition to Vladimir Putin and has been given persona non grata for life since 2010 by the president himself. It's quite an accolade to have. But Jason, it's lovely to finally have you on the program. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you, Piotr.
Yes, excited to hear your perspective. So you're currently in Ukraine, and how are people in that part of the country looking at the situation in Russia? How is it being reported? And are things as bad as they seem, or are the West trying to overplay this economic situation?
Well, I think that it's sort of interesting that the Western press talks a lot about what's not going well with Ukraine. Electricity, for instance, or in the war. But it often lacks what's going on in Russia. It's just even worse. It's very challenging for Russia. The situation is not good. And we see that in a lot of different ways. We see that, economically, politically, there's a high degree of instability. Militarily, they're not doing well. They're lacking a lot of things, including shells, including soldiers. And all this is, in the end, creating a degree of instability in the country, which is unprecedented. I mean, in the past 25 years, there has not been this degree of instability in Russia. And the possibility, and I think the very real possibility, that the war in Ukraine will come to a sudden end due to one of the major pillars of Russia collapsing, which has been my argument since the very beginning. I don't think that there will be a military victory for Ukraine where they simply liberate all the territory and the Russians go home and say, you won, take back your land, it's fine, we give up. I think that's unrealistic. I don't think anyone really expects that to happen. But I think much more realistic is that Russia faces some sort of an economic crisis, which doesn't allow it to pay its soldiers or creates hyperinflation, or has a military crisis, such as in the case of Prigozhin, where there's an attempted coup within the officer corps. Or I think that there is a possibility that there is a political destabilizing event, such as the assassination of the dictator. In any of these cases, there could be something tragic, I mean that word jokingly, that all of a sudden changes the situation in Russia, and they are no longer able to wage war.
But, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Do you really think that that's something, one, that is realistic? Russia is increasingly dependent on China. We've seen the limitations of their relationship surrounding the Siberian 2 pipeline a few weeks ago, but immediately more pro-Putinist voices on X, Twitter, and so on are saying, no, it's not that bad. But do you really think that a Russia collapsing, so to speak, or fragmenting is a good thing? And 2, really realistic, given the reliance so many other states need Russia for? and therefore would want to keep Putin in power, or at least have some kind of government structure.
I can't imagine what state really needs Russia to be in power or Putin to be in power. China, for instance, 55% of its trade is with the United States and the European Union. Less than 2% is with the Russian Federation. If you look at the United States and allies, so we add South Korea, Japan, and others, all of a sudden it's over 65% of trade of China is done with American partners. So do they really need less than 2% of their trade, which is Russia? I don't think so. I think that the Chinese, at the end of the day, I think they understand what Russia is doing behooves them to a degree. They're willing to bolster that, to assist that to some degree. But are they willing to risk everything they have for that? Absolutely not. And I think that the secondary sanctions that the United States has just enacted, which were followed on by other countries, as you know, were very important because they put sanctions on banks within China itself. And I think that China has never in its history that I can recall taken a risk that all of a sudden is going to have an economic risk. I mean, they're willing to do things that are risky or to say things, but are they willing to actually destroy their economy? No. I think Chinese friendship usually works out in a way that they will work with you as long as it is profitable, only up until that point. The day after it's profitable for them, they're no longer willing to do it. So Russia in this case might be sort of like the dumb kid in school, the dunce who they egg on to go do something foolish, and they laugh about it, but they're not willing to get in trouble for his errors. And I think it's sort of the same situation here.
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree that the fanfaredom around the Russia-Korea trip, which we did a video on a few days ago, people you could find it above, but is overblown because the Chinese are one of the probably several countries that are not overly happy with the relationship. China doesn't want a growing destabilization or, shall we say, disruption to its near abroad because of its own interest strategically and economically, as you say, with the West. I find that, Russia and North Korea are much more reckless powers versus China, which is systemically, wants to keep the status quo economically speaking, but it wants to be more of a leader, right? A counterbalance to the US, which wouldn't require the behavior Russia does have under Putin. I don't know if you'd agree with such a sentiment, but, what does the economic situation in Russia tell us about Putin's priorities right now and why he's going to such extent to make these economic policy changes, but also make this shuttle diplomacy?
So I think that the monetary policy of Russia is actually sort of a fascinating topic. One of the most, actually in the whole war, I think one of the most interesting things that goes on that is almost never talked about is what's going on financially in Russia. And that is sort of key. So let's contrast two things. What we have in Ukraine as a unique system is that obviously they're receiving free assistance from everywhere, whether it's the weapons, whether it's for their budget and everything else. This is free money, essentially. Even if it's a loan to be paid off over the next hundreds of years, it's essentially free money. Russia actually has to come up with money to pay for what it's doing. It really has to actually pay these expenses. So the situations these two countries are in are totally different. They're totally unique. In the case of Russia, one of the first things Putin did after the invasion began, I think it was the day after, 2 days after, he gave a speech on national television. And in the course of his speech, aside from outlining why he was doing this invasion, he said a lot of very interesting things. He said, we have new priorities. And those new priorities was the increase of the amount of money spent on pensions, is increase in the amount of money being spent on domestic production, increase in the amount of money being spent on government payroll, in amounts of building within the country, but a lot of different things. And in the end, as you know, whenever the government starts to spend tons of money, that creates inflation. And in the case of Russia, we see the secondary effects of inflation. Officially, the Russian inflation rate, they say, might reach 11% this month or next month. That's a joke. I mean, Johns Hopkins University last week, an economist there came out and said it's about 24% is what he estimates the real inflation rate to be. In addition to that, the key interest rate of central banks about 17%. And that's about to go up again. It looks like it's going to get up to 20, maybe 21%. 21% interest rate, that's going to choke off businesses. That kills lending at the local level. And that means that there's going to be less growth. But what do we see that's sort of strange? Typically, you would expect to see all of a sudden job creation decline with that sort of high inflation rate, high interest rate to combat the inflation. We see something very strange. We see that the unemployment rate's like 2%. So how is that possible? Why is unemployment rate so low? It's an indication of high, very, very, very high inflation. You're creating jobs even when there's not a necessity to have those jobs. So you're just giving full employment to people. full employment's not really possible. You don't want full employment in an economy. Ideal unemployment rate's typically about 5%. So when Russia says they have 2%, they're dealing with something very strange. These are all outside signs that the ruble is losing value. As you indicated, the official exchange rate today is about 87 ruble to the dollar. We all know that's a joke. We know that the black market rate's closer to about 150 or so. It's totally different from what the official number is. And we see last week other significant signs of economic instability in Russia. We saw that Moscow Exchange, the primary stock market in the country, was sanctioned by the United States. It's no longer able to have access to dollars or to euros or to Hong Kong dollars either. Now, the lack of liquidity that they have and the sanctions that are put on the clearinghouse, which is the one that actually does the buying and selling, the trading of the dollars, it guarantees if your bank is selling dollars that you can sell it to a foreign bank and that sort of thing, was also sanctioned. What's the impact of that? Well, we saw that the Moscow Exchange, as well as the clearinghouse, as well as probably 4 of the major banks in the country, all went offline for a number of days last week. It's understood that it was probably to decrease the amount of sales. They didn't want everyone to start selling their assets, or they didn't want anyone to change their money out to hard currency. Likewise, we see that within Russia itself, that there was a quite a crisis, I would argue, that till today, Moscow Exchange is not allowing after-hours trading or early hours trading, and they've changed. I think it's now 9:45 in the morning. Opens up their exchange, so they've pushed back the time that the exchange opens. These are all signs that things are not going well in Russia. And so as much as they say that things are going great, we simply don't see that. Pensions in Russia are being eaten up by the very high inflation rate. Putin has pledged to increase the amount of money going to pensions. They're introducing a new tax. I think all understand that new tax is really just a mechanism to try to curb inflation, but it's also a mechanism to raise more money from the war effort. But ultimately, that increase will do very little. Russia simply lacks. Russia's deficit right now is quite large. I mean, it's significant. And they're not able to keep up with what they're doing. At some point, it will have to be that Russia pays for this. And the way that it pays for this is going to be, I think, extremely painful for the national economy.
So I think everyone who remembers their days in economics, particularly on the full unemployment or full employment and inflation, keep in mind that, employers pay high wages, as you say, but then that ultimately begins to increase wage inflation. And this is something that we are seeing in Russia occur quite clearly, albeit people don't really want to, I think, draw attention to that. Again, to be contrarian, a lot of people will, though, argue or just simply dismiss what you're saying and say, well, regardless of what's happening in Russia, which probably isn't that bad, Europe has, continued to utilize and consume Russian energy, and therefore they're paying Russia even though they're fighting Russia. And so this whole war is pointless, right? I'll give you 2 examples. So for LNG, Austria has now surpassed its consumption levels since 2022, when the full-scale war began. And just last week, Financial Times reported that, Russia is now overtaken and replaced America as the biggest supplier of LNG to the continent. Is this not rather insane that we've got, countries that are not, talking about in Europe, that are, abiding by their, requirements, commitments, and continuing to support Putin's war by consuming energy, or they just don't have a choice? What do you say to those counterpoints?
Well, of course. I mean, we should be sanctioning those things. We should not be purchasing things from Russia. But at the end of the day, let's remember that, energy is about 23% of the budget of Russia, though it is a very large percentage of the total amount of foreign exchange that they do. The actual amount of the budget, it's let's say about a quarter of the overall amount that they have. Russia's problems, though, get much more complicated when you look at oil prices and the decline that they've had. Russia's problems get much more complicated when you look at the fact that their long-term strategy was to move away from the West, thinking that the West was no longer a stable partner, and to move towards China. As you highlighted, there was this hope that they would build a pipeline to China. And the Chinese came back last week and said, yeah, that's great, build a pipeline, but we're not willing to pay for it. We're not willing to buy all this gas or oil from you, energy from you. We're not interested in what you're trying to sell. So you're going to be sort of stuck with all those costs yourself. And it's not going to be this golden solution you've hoped for. So when you've got a market and you've got something to sell and nobody wants to buy it, that's usually a very bad sign. We see that, look what's happened in India. Look at the complications Russia has had. You would imagine that relationship, Russia would have much more of an upper hand, but of course it doesn't. It's stuck with a ton of rupees right now because the Indians aren't willing to destabilize their economy by changing over to rubles. They're paying with rupees. The Russians cannot get the rupees out of the banks in India because you can't take that much currency out at once. They're having tons of complications with that. And at the end of the day, the Indians are buying less now than they were last year from the Russians because they don't want to lose a relationship with the United States. I think that overall, Russia is going to have more and more complications going forward just because it has not diversified its economy in the past 30 years. And the Russian economy, I think, historically is sort of known for its instability. And anyone that doesn't recognize it or remember in recent history, not even 100 years ago, 1916, they had significant economic crisis as well, which then led to 1917. But they also had, keep in mind what happened in 1916, where the Russian military sort of just dissipated, fell apart at the fronts. And in the end, they ended up negotiating a peace to get out of the war. But neither here nor there. Look at what happened in the inflation that was created in the 1980s in the Soviet Union that then led to its collapse. Look at 1998 when the ruble collapsed. Russia's got a history of sort of, just in the past 25 years, or since independence, it's had a couple of very serious periods of endemic growth, but also very serious periods of inflation. And I think what we're seeing now there's nothing to tie the ruble to anything. It's serious. If your economy really has nothing, look at the foreign reserves that Russia has. What are the foreign reserves that Russia has? You've seen them go down. It's no longer held in dollars or euros. It's got some gold. It's got a ton of rubles. So you're guaranteeing your country's economy with your own currency is not something that really assures people that things are going great. You're not a reserve currency for anybody in the world. They're trying to tie things to the yuan, but even Raiffeisen Bank will not allow people in Moscow to take out more than a certain amount of yuan per day because they're worried about the Chinese currency simply disappearing. There's too much demand for it and too few people want ruble. The demand for dollar or euro remains very, very high. The Chinese are unwilling to really help with the monetary policy of Russia because they themselves don't want rubles either. They're happy to give them some yuan to sell them some or whatever it is, but they're not unwilling to do anything that will be threatening to their own national economy.
So one of the things that I think plays into all of this is the time frame, and the question I think a lot of people wonder is whether or not Russia can sort of force the capitulation of Ukraine. This is more a conversation about Russia's economic and internal standing than it is explicitly the war front. What kind of time frame are we talking about here for there to be systemic changes and challenges to Russia that it suddenly does have to pull out, or it just cannot function without significant support and dependency from neighboring, partnering? ObviouslyRussia's going to run to North Korea for its economic support, tongue-in-cheek their views. But what does this mean long term? Is this I'll put it this way very simply, is this a hope by Western nations that by continuing to constrain the Russian economy, in the longer term, it will force the eventual, collapse or inability for it to function? That sanctions are taking time to work, but they will eventually crunch. But a lot of people are wondering whether or not Ukraine will break first. Is that the sort of framing that people are misunderstanding when it comes to these sorts of things?
Well, I think the whole purpose of the sanctions is specifically to put pressure and pain on Russia so that it has to rethink its decisions. Now, historically, sanctions have not worked in any case that I can readily think of where it's broken an economy. It does, create problems. And those problems are typically over something that you're able to solution the longer they go on. Initially, they have the most impact. Long term, they have a bleeding impact. But the initial shock, the most amazing parts initially, but the long-term stunt of growth that we expect to see in Russia, we're seeing the effects of. Even when the war started, I remember that sanctions experts were saying that the reality is like year 3 of the war is when you'll start to really see the impacts of the sanctions. So it's not a very fast process. Now, will this cause Russia to pull out of the war? I think it depends on what happens. And we really don't know. Let's be honest, is that Russia is the most sanctioned country in history. It has more sanctions on it than Iran and North Korea combined. Mm-hmm. It's amazing the sanctions that Russia has on it. And they're growing. And all the time they're growing. And I think that ultimately what will happen or what will transpire is almost impossible to predict. I think that there's a very good probability that Russia will be forced into a position or an economic situation where some people in Putin's own circle might recognize that it's in their own interest to get rid of him, not because they're against the war or they're natural allies of the West, but simply because look at the recent shakeup, whether it was Shoigu or anyone else who was taken out. These are signs that, Putin was dissatisfied with some of his upper leadership. And really important people like Patrushev, who were very important, very close to Putin, were taken out of their positions. And I think that there is a chance, once you have situations like that occur, people sometimes get, and they end up killing people. And it's actually a rational decision. I think if we were to look at this as game theory, if you're around Putin, it makes a lot of sense to want to kill him. And the reason is very simple. If I recognize that I am not one of his favorite people, or I am one of his favorite people, because I'm in his inner circle, and the other people are also his favorite people, that's why they're in their circle. But I recognize that Putin will eventually die. He is 72. He will croak. And when he does croak, somebody's going to take his position. And if I know that person is opposed to me, they're not part of the faction that I'm part of. They're part of my opposing faction. And that means that when they take power, they will kill me. And that quite literally, when they take power after Putin, they will kill me and my family and take all of our wealth. Then why would I sit around and wait for Putin just to die a natural death? The more rational decision is to kill Putin yourself so you can guarantee your own power and your longevity after his death. So you want to control the narrative of who takes control of Russia. To leave that to chance, to leave that to the unknown, when you're already sanctioned, you know that the West is never be open to you. You're already associated with an international crime. You've only really got Russia open to you. And even if you were to go somewhere where they welcome you, like India, nothing's going to prevent you from getting killed there either, or assassinated, right? Going out of a window. And so ultimately, the wisest decision you could do if you're close to Putin, recognizing different factions at war, even if you love Putin, is to realize he is going to die. He is mortal. So it's better to take control of that, to make sure he dies, and to make sure that you and your faction takes power of the Kremlin versus some other faction.
So let's be a little bit more specific here. Back in, mid-May, just after Victory Day, which is in the beginning of May, Putin undertook this, pretty significant reshuffle, as some people call it. Some others consider it a optimization. And one of the most notable was offering the post of defense minister to Andrei Borisov, who is an economist and the former deputy prime minister. What does that tell us about Putin's priorities in terms of his leadership? I have a follow-up question about post-Putin, if there's, wonderful thought to consider. But, what should we take away from the sort of refocusing and, optimization, if you agree with that, in terms of his reshuffle?
So I think that, everyone made the argument because the new leader is a economist. This means that Putin is preparing for a war economy. I think I wouldn't necessarily agree with that argument. I think he's an economist, which means that he's able to track down the waste and the fraud better, namely the waste and the fraud that was being managed by Shoigu and his friends for decades. And they are. I mean, look at the numbers of arrests that have already been made at senior leadership of the Russian military. There's been a lot of arrests recently, which once again undercuts, I think, the general legitimacy of the military in the eyes of soldiers. If you know that you are there in the front, you've got virtually no weapons, and you're underdressed, and you don't have great food, and you don't have a lot of anything, and every day in the news that there's another general being arrested, and that's where the money's ultimately going. Well, what are you dying for? You don't need to die. They're dying at your expense. And so it's very, I think, undercuts a lot of their authority, which once again creates more problems within the military, which is why Prigozhin had the upsurge of support that he did have. And as you know, Wagner Group itself had a high prestige level because of that, because he was frequently on Prigozhin was making his videos saying, Shoigu, Gerasimov, where are my artillery? Where are my shells? Where are my weapons? And he was asking these questions all the time. And the soldiers thought he was really defending their interest. And in the end, by the way, Putin did take Prigozhin's recommendations, and he did get rid of Shoigu for his corruption. But what's going on now, according to the pre-invasion estimates within Russia and the pre-invasion estimates from the West, which agree with each other, about a third of the Russian military budget is embezzled, stolen. So when you're losing about a third of the money, then you're losing another 24% due to inflation. The reality is that the Russian military is spending, and then you consider that Russia is not spending its entire military on Ukraine. It's spread out. Keep in mind, they have got a ton of soldiers around Russia to put down protests, to put down invasions. Invasions less likely, more likely protest. especially in the Moscow area. They have troops stationed there all the time for that specific purpose, but they tend to be Chechens, but neither here nor there. They have them. They have a ton of people in the Caucasus. Russia's actual military spending on Ukraine is not a lot more than the military spending of Ukraine. The difference, once again, is that Russia is spending its own money. Ukraine is spending the West money. So it's actually much more affordable for the Ukrainians in the long term. And with the weapons that Ukraine now has, the long-distance weapons, and now with the ability to strike within Russia, Russia does not have the ability to coalesce soldiers in a way to advance. They are able to keep these Russian troops back, which is preventing Russia from making any gains. Remember, in all of 2023, Russia gained a net of 57 square kilometers. The second largest military in the world gained 57 square kilometers in the course of an entire year, having lost in that period of time. I can't remember the numbers now, but I want to say last year was about 220,000 casualties on the Russian side, 240,000 casualties for 57 square kilometers. So if Volchansk takes this long to take, or let's look at an easier example that everyone remembers. Look at the oh gosh, what's the name of the battle? It was just a few months ago. The city had 32,000 people. Which one?
Adivka?
Adivka, thank you. Pre-war population of 32,000 people. Russia lost over 45,000 troops to take it. So if you have to lose exponentially more soldiers to take a village, what would it be realistically to take a city of 1 million people? Russia just doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't. Whether it's the soldiers, whether it's the artillery, whether it's the technologies, it doesn't. And we've seen that the ongoing drones that the U.S. uses for surveillance purposes, we see flying over the Black Sea all the time. It's fantastic. Everyone understands that it's picking up the radio communications that the Russians use. Keep in mind, the vast majority of the internet, 85% of the world's internet, goes through the United States. The U.S. is able to intercept essentially all the communications of Russia. Hence why they had such a clear idea of what was going to happen in the invasion. They knew exactly what was going to happen. And in this case, the U.S. continues to assist Ukraine with that intelligence, which makes it almost impossible for Russia to mount any sort of significant attack on Ukraine. And now it's been weeks and weeks of talk about Volchansk, and it's certainly hell there, but Russia cannot even take a village.
Well, I think that's a good point, because we've also got how many incursions in and around Belgorod in the past few weeks, and the Russians, which I think Putin would have made it quite clear, any and increasing offensives by the Ukrainians into Russia would be a red line. But as so far, there's not been very much done by the Russian military in response to those drone attacks and strikes. The Black Sea seems to be becoming a bit of a dumping ground for Russian naval vessels as well, a bit of a graveyard, right? You'll soon be able to walk from sort of the Bosphorus to Crimea because of the amount, I think, of Russian ships lining the seabed. But I did want to ask you a little bit more specifically about a couple of the people who've been shifted around, right? A lot of people, I think, saw that the primary change was about Shoigu and Belousov, and the others that were appointed around were sort of simply, to make that move possible. But one of them is Patrushev, because I consider him, Nikolai Patrushev, for those who are not as familiar, is a very important member of Putin's inner circle, and he has been the head of the Security Council, and I think instrumental in both ideological and pragmatic parts of Putin's foreign policy. What's your take on him particularly? A lot of people, I think, consider him to be a high candidate, in a post-Putin scenario, or you don't see him as important as some other members of Putin's inner circle?
Well, so Patrushev's an interesting story. So Patrushev Papa, who's been around forever, he's been friends with Putin for 40-something years at this point, he was cycled out. Now, his son stayed in power. His son remains the Minister of Agriculture of Russia, and he's the one sort of favored to take over, I think, after Putin was always the story that he would take over. And there's a lot of, contradiction of why people think he was taken out of circulation after this many years of being so close to Putin. I tend to agree that there's two major things that occurred. One, I think that after the attack in Moscow a few months ago, Patrushev initially, tried to say that this was a global war and that this was Islamic. And then, this narrative changed that it was actually Ukrainians working with these ISIS, which is just sort of crazy. And so there was obviously a problem there in the narratives. I think that what occurred in Moscow, I think there's a very good chance that it was organized by the FSB, and it went very badly. It did not turn out right. Or was by other special services, not necessarily the FSB, but other special services. But it turned out very badly. The contradictions that Moscow stated were grave. It undercut the authority of Moscow, the Kremlin. And so I think this was something that was a big black mark next to Patrushev's name. In addition to that, I think that Patrushev is his replacement, I think, is sort of fascinating for a secondary reason. So if we look at who's around Putin these days, it's changing really quickly in the sense that from people that I've spoken to who worked with Putin more than 20 years ago, Putin was known to be sort of open-minded, actually, surprisingly open to talking to people, getting diverse views. People would disagree in a meeting, so he'd want to hear both sides, try to judge what was a better decision. And he's lost that. As far as we can tell, Putin thinks that he is the foremost expert on every issue, which is good for everybody in the world because that means his country is more of a banana republic than it was before. And so we see this in economics, for instance, where, the head of the central bank is very smart. She definitely knows what she's doing. She's done a lot to try to control the economy. It's unfortunate that she's so smart. But Putin, thank God, keeps undermining her and keeps printing money and keeps, creating new social work projects, which just eat money and just will eventually, further deplete the country's supplies. Now, in the case of the intelligence services, or in the case of Patrushev, we see that Patrushev himself, I want to say, is 72 or 74 years old. He's not very young. He's about the same age as Putin, though. That's like sort of going towards the average. I mean, Shoigu was a little bit younger, but in general, these guys are getting older and older and older, and they're past retirement age anywhere in the West. And what that ultimately shows, though, is that the circle around Putin is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. He's not open to the new people. He's not open to the people who have new ideas how to approach things. He's not surrounding himself with people who are going to give him a fresh glance at the world. He's surrounding himself with yes men. And that's actually a dangerous situation for a dictator. And it happens a lot to dictators, is their world gets smaller and they start to become more and more isolated from the realities on the ground. And that's where bad decisions get made. And I think Putin is falling into that trap. Fortunately, Patrushev had the reputation of having a very strong interest in trying to negotiate the West. He had a reputation of being somebody who saw cooperation with the West as being in the long term positive for Russia. Though ideologically he does obviously agree with Putin in most things, he understood that the West was sort of a necessary thing. So in the terrorist attack in Moscow, there is a rumor that, he was interested in working with the West to combat Islamic terrorism. And he said, maybe we should work together. Now, that sort of idealism today in Russia is totally lost. You can't propose that sort of a solution. The solution is never, let's work with the West. And so there's another thing that was a black mark next to his name. But the fact that his son was not replaced, I think is probably a good sign. It means that he's not totally out. He's not banished forever. But if his son is also replaced in the coming weeks or months, it's a sign that, Patrushev is really in hot water, and we probably won't hear much from him ever again.
So the very last question I have for you is a little bit of scenario planning, a little bit of gameplay here. We've touched upon the sort of different scenarios, right? And as strategists, as forecasters, well, maybe not myself, but, you with your expertise on this, we've touched upon the fragmentation scenario, that Russia could fragment internally, and you could see Russia becoming occupied by domestic tensions, central regional disputes, racially charged ones, as we've seen in Dagestan last year at the airport, Chechnya historically, obviously, and generally areas that I think Putin is trying to prioritize utilizing, mobilization from. But that's one scenario. But then the second one that I've read in other reports is the radicalization, right? Perish the thought, but for people, if you're not as aware, there are people more extreme than Putin. I mean, Putin is extreme, but there are people who are even more radical and think that Putin is not doing enough. And there was one article I was reading that was talking about how we could have a sort of a radicalization where, a sort of the Slaviki, what's known as the Slavikian Russia security military elite, they see Putin as basically a hindrance to outright victory in Ukraine. And so they basically try to oust him, or in your case, as you mentioned at the beginning, a sort of some assassination. And then there's a third type, which one article called it the retrenchment scenario, sort of like a Khrushchev kind of person, individual who tries to take power and pursue Putinism, but without Putin. if that makes sense. It's sort of like Khrushchev when, at the end of the Second World War and during the early phases of the Cold War, he was trying to focus on economic recovery and domestic stability over sort of confrontation with the US, NATO, and so on. Out of these scenarios, which one do you think is more probable? I know which one I would prefer, but what's your take on these sorts of different scenarios that people come up with?
I think Putin already recognized the risk of somebody who is more extreme than him coming to power. Hence why he put Igor Girkin, Strakov in jail. Hence why Prigozhin is dead. He always realized that there's a risk of that sort of viewpoint. And at the same time, I think it's sort of unrealistic to Russian history and to history as a whole of how fiefdoms work, that's what would happen. I think it's much more probable that when Putin dies, even if somebody who's an extremist comes to power, they would have enough of a basic understanding of history that the most dangerous part of any revolution is the counter-revolutionary phase, the reactionary phase, which is immediately thereafter. When people reject the idea that you're the new leader, because let's be fair, you don't have any legitimacy. I mean, you weren't elected. So you just took power by force. Why are you the new leader and I'm not the new leader? And there's really no justification you have other than to say that, well, we did it. But how do you keep the power? So world history shows that you keep the power by keeping soldiers around you. And also, suppressing your opponents. It's usually good to, wipe them all out. So I think what would probably happen, even if tomorrow Putin would be overthrown by, let's imagine, somebody more extreme than him, I think that person would most likely have to call a lot of soldiers back from Ukraine and other places to Moscow. Because at the end of the day, you need those soldiers to put down insurrections. You need them around Russia to make sure that nobody's going to take you from power. Keep in mind, if some part of Siberia were to break off, one of the gas producing regions, for instance, it would be by far the richest country in the world if it became a country. As far in comparison to Dubai, Dubai would be nothing. So why, if I'm the governor of that region and I have my own private military, would I ever want to give it back to Moscow, or give it back to Russia? If the country starts to break apart, I don't think it'll be on ethnic lines. I think it'll be on financial lines. I think the person who has, rare metals in his district would want to control that. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes Putin made. Now, he's tried to correct this since, by the way, Prigozhin was insurrected. But I think one of the biggest mistakes Putin ever made was the fact that he allowed so many private militaries to be created. I mean, that's really a recipe for disaster. And the reason for that was because they could no longer guarantee things like Gazprom's security. And so the way that they were able to do that was by allowing them to create their own private militaries. Now, the real risk that comes with that, there's a lot of them. But one of them is every one of these major enterprises within Russia has an oligarch who's in charge of it. That means these different oligarchs are like, once again, as I described it, a fiefdom. They're different lords with their own militaries. They're private militaries, which means if Putin were to die or if there were to be some sort of chaos within Russia, these different lords could begin battling with each other and fighting with each other to maintain their own fiefdom, their own territory, whatever that is, whether it's rare earth or it's gas or whatever. And I think that's got a pretty good chance of happening. I mean, the conditions are there to do it. Who else is going to keep it? I mean, if I'm the one who's in charge of all the oil in Russia or all the gas, why, after Putin dies, I've got a very good position today, but after Putin dies, why am I going to just give that all up to some other oligarch? Why is that good for me? And why would anyone keep you alive to begin with? I mean, doesn't it make much more sense just to kill him? And then all of a sudden, I take all of his money, and he's not going to ever challenge me in the future. Once again, if you don't kill people who challenge you, they will challenge you in the future. So I think that the conditions within Russia are pretty awful. I mean, I would be very concerned if I had a ton of money in Russia of what's going to happen post-Putin, which once again, I think puts power in the Kremlin to eventually get rid of Putin. Somebody will, not because they're against him, simply to guarantee their own security after Putin. Because if you're not the one who's driving history, someone else is going to drive it for you. And it's probably going to work out very badly.
Indeed. And with that, everyone, Jason, it's been a pleasure. I don't really like to think of what a post-Putin Russia looks like, other than hopefully it's more constructive in the world, mainly because I can't see who would come next. But that's something I will like to explore with you in a subsequent episode. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. As always, everyone, if you enjoyed, be sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in all the next one. Take care.